While the Eothid still dwelt in their former home, they were well known to Gondor as a people of good trust, from whom they received news of all that passed in that region. They were a remnant of the Northmen, who were held to be akin in ages past to the Dunedain, and in the days of the great kings had been their allies and contributed much of their blood to the people of Gondor. It was thus of great concern to Gondor when the Eothid removed into the far north in the days of J.R.R. II, last but one of the kings of the southern realm. The new land of the Eothid lay north of Mirkwood, between the Mist Mountains westward and the Forest River eastward. Southward it extended to the confluence of the two short rivers that they named Graelin and Lengwell. Graelin flowed down from Ered Mithrin, the Grey Mountains, but Lengwell came from the Mist Mountains, and this name it bore because it was the source of Anduin, which, from its junction with Graelin, they called Lengflood. Messengers still passed between Gondor and the Eothid after their departure, but it was some 450 of our miles between the confluence of Graelin and Lengwell, where was their only fortified burg, and the inflow of limelight into Anduin in a direct line as a bird might fly, and much more for those who journeyed on earth, and in like manner some 800 miles to Minas Tirith. The Chronicle of Cirion and Eorl reports no events before the battle of the field of Celebrand, but from other sources they may be made out to have been of this sort. The wide lands south of Mirkwood, from the Brown Lands to the Sea of Rhun, which offered no obstacle to invaders from the east until they came to Anduin, were a chief source of concern and unease to the rulers of Gondor. But during the watchful peace, the forts along the Anduin, especially on the west shores of the Undeeps, had been unmanned and neglected. After that time, Gondor was assailed both by orcs out of Mordor, which had long been unguarded, and by the corsairs of Umbar, and had neither men nor opportunity for manning the line of Anduin north of Emyn Muil. Cirion became steward of Gondor in the year 2489. The menace from the north was ever in his mind, and he gave much thought to ways that might be devised against the threat of invasion from that quarter. As the strength of Gondor diminished, he put a few men into the old fort to keep watch on the Undeeps, and sent scouts and spies into the lands between Mirkwood and Dagorlad. He was thus soon aware that new and dangerous enemies coming out of the east were steadily drifting in from beyond the Sea of Rhun. They were slaying or driving north up the river running, and into the forest the remnant of the Northmen, friends of Gondor that still dwelt east of Mirkwood. But he could do nothing to aid them, and it became more and more dangerous to gather news. Too many of his scouts never returned. It was thus not until the winter of the year 2509 was past that Cirion became aware that a great movement against Gondor was being prepared. Hosts of men were mustering all along the southern eaves of Mirkwood. They were only rudely armed, and had no great number of horses for riding, using horses mainly for draught, since they had many large wains, as had the Wain Riders, to whom they were no doubt akin, that assailed Gondor in the last days of the kings. But what they lacked in gear of war they made up in numbers, so far as could be guessed. In this peril, Cirion's thought turned at last in desperation to the Eothid, and he determined to send messengers to them. But they would have to go through Calenhardon and over the Undeeps, and then through lands already watched and patrolled by the Balkoth, before they could reach the Vales of Anduin. This would mean a ride of some 450 miles to the Undeeps, and more than 500 thence to the Eothid, and from the Undeeps they would be forced to go warily, and mostly by night until they had passed the shadow of Dol Guldur. Cirion had little hope that any of them would get through. He called for volunteers, and choosing 6 riders of great courage and endurance, he sent them out in pairs with a day's interval between them. Each bore a message learned by heart, and also a small stone incised with the seal of the stewards, that he should deliver to the Lord of the Eorl in person, if he succeeded in reaching that land. The message was addressed to Eorl, son of Leod, for Cirion knew that he had succeeded his father some years before, when he was but a youth of 16, and though now no more than 25, was praised in all such tidings as reached Gondor as a man of great courage and wise beyond his years. Yet Cirion had but faint hope that even if the message were received, it would be answered. He had no claim on the Eorl beyond their ancient friendship with Gondor to bring them so far away with any strength that would avail. The tidings that the Balcoth were destroying the last of their kin in the south, if they did not know it already, might give weight to his appeal, if the Eorl themselves were not threatened by any attack. Cirion said no more, and ordered what strength he had to meet the storm. He gathered as great a force as he could, and taking command of it himself, made ready as swiftly as might be to lead it north to Calenhardon. Halas, his son, he left in command at Minas Tirith. The first pair of messengers left on the 10th day of Sulime, and in the event it was one of these, alone of all the 6 who got through to the Eorl. He was Borondir, a great rider of a family that claimed descent from a captain of the Northmen in the service of the kings of old. Of the others no tidings were ever heard, save of Borondir's companion. He was slain by arrows in ambush as they passed near Dol Guldur, from which Borondir escaped by fortune and the speed of his horse. He was pursued as far north as the Gladden fields, and often waylaid by men that came out of the forest and forced him to ride far out of the direct way. He came at last to the Eorl after 15 days, for the last 2 without food, and he was so spent that he could scarce speak his message to Eorl. It was then the 25th day of Sulime. Eorl took counsel with him in silence, but not for long. Soon he rose, and he said, "I will come. If the Munbug falls, whither shall we flee from the darkness?" Then he took Borondir's hand in token of his promise. Eorl at once summoned his council of elders, and began to prepare for the great riding. But this took many days, for the host had to be gathered and mustered, and thought taken for the ordering of the people and the defence of the land. At that time the Eorl were at peace and had no fear of war, though it might prove otherwise when it became known that their lord had ridden away to battle far off in the south. Nonetheless, Eorl saw well that nothing less than his full strength would serve, and he must risk all or draw back and break his promise. At last the whole host was assembled, and only a few hundreds were left behind to support the men unfitted for such a desperate venture by youth or age. It was then the 6th day of the month of Vereser. On that day in silence the great Eorl set out, leaving fear behind, and taking with them small hope, for they knew not what lay before them, either on the road or at its end. It is said that Eorl led forth some 7,000 fully armed riders and some hundreds of horsed archers. At his right hand rode Borondir to serve as guide, so far as he might, since he had lately passed through the lands. But this great host was not threatened or assailed during its long journey down the vales of Anduin. Such folk of good or evil kind as saw it approach fled out of its path for fear of its might and splendour. As it drew southward and passed by southern Mirkwood, below the great East Bight, which was now infested by the Balcoth, still there were no sign of men, in force or in scouting parties, to bar their road or to spy upon their coming. In part this was due to events unknown to them, which had come to pass since Borondir set out, but other powers also were at work. For when at last the host drew near to Dol Guldur, Eorl turned away westward for fear of the dark shadow and cloud that flowed out from it. And then he rode on within sight of Anduin. Many of the riders turned their eyes thither, half in fear and half in hope to glimpse from afar the shimmer of the Dweimordene, the perilous land that in legends of their people was said to shine like gold in the springtime. But now it seemed shrouded in a gleaming mist, and to their dismay the mist passed over the river and flowed over the land before them. Eorl did not halt. "Ride on," he commanded. "There is no other way to take. After so long a road, shall we be held back from battle by a river mist?" As they drew near, they saw that the white mist was driving back the glooms of Dol Guldur, and soon they passed into it, riding slowly at first and warily, but under its canopy all things were lit with a clear and shadowless light, while left and right they were guarded as it were by white walls of secrecy. "The Lady of the Golden Wood is on our side, it seems," said Brondia. "Maybe," said Eorl, "but at least I will trust the wisdom of Felarof." He sensed no evil. His heart is high, and his weariness is healed. He is strange to be given his head. So be it, for never have I had more need of secrecy and speed. Then Felarof sprang forward, and all the host behind followed like a great wind, but in a strange silence, as if their hooves did not beat upon the ground. So they rode on, as fresh and eager as on the morning of their setting out. During that day and the next, but at the dawn of the third they rose from their rest, and suddenly the mist was gone, and they saw that they were far out in the open lands, and on their right the Anduin lay near, but they had almost passed its great eastward loop, and the Undeeps were in sight. It was the morning of the 15th day of Eorl, and they had come there at speed beyond hope. A great host of wild men from the northeast swept over Rovanion, and coming down out of the brown land crossed the Anduin on the rafts. At the same time, by chance or design, the orcs, who at the time before their war with the dwarfs were in great strength, made a descent from the mountains. The invaders overran Calenhardon, and Cirion, steward of Gondor, sent north for help. When Eorl and his riders came to the field of Celebrant, the Northman army of Gondor was in peril. Defeated in the wold, and cut off from the south, it had been driven across the Limelight, and it was then suddenly assailed by the orc host that pressed it towards the Anduin. All hope was lost when, unlooked for, the riders came out of the north and broke upon the rear of the enemy. Then the fortunes of battle were reversed, and the enemy was driven with slaughter over Limelight. Eorl led his men in pursuit, and so great was the fear that went before the horsemen of the north that the invaders of the wold were also thrown into panic, and the riders hunted them over the plains of Calenhardon. It seems certain that the riders, having passed over the Undeeps, then crossed the Limelight, and fell upon the rear of the enemy at the field of Celebrant, and the enemy was driven with slaughter over Limelight. The Balkulf were driven back southwards into the wold.